On the coldest winter of 1883, a widowed rancher faces foreclosure, a hired gun, and a drifter with storms in his eyes. When the law turns crooked and the snow turns deadly, will she harden into ice or risk everything on a fragile promise that could finally thaw her heart forever? The wind was a blade against my face, honed sharp on the endless frozen plains of Wyoming. It was the winter of 1888, a winter so fierce it felt personal, as if the land itself was trying to scrape the memory of life from its bones. For months the snow had fallen, burying the world in a shroud of white, so profound it stole the color from the sky, leaving only shades of gray and a cold that seeped into the marrow. The sun was a distant, indifferent coin in the heavens, offering light, but no warmth. My name is Eleanor Vance, and at 27 I felt as ancient as the frosted peaks of the Tetons that loomed in the distance. Grief was a cruel sculptor, and it had carved lines of hardship around my eyes and mouth, lines that didn't belong on a woman my age. My hands, once soft enough to soothe a fevered brow or handle fine needlework, were now chapped and raw, calloused from splitting wood and hauling buckets of near-frozen water. The black wool of my dress, a constant reminder of my widowhood, was worn thin, but I clung to it. It was the last piece of the woman I used to be, the wife of Arthur Vance. It had been nearly a year since the accident. A year since the world had tilted on its axis and thrown me into this cold, silent existence. Arthur had been clearing a fallen pine after an early blizzard, a behemoth of a tree that blocked our path to the road. The snow had hidden a patch of ice beneath its trunk. One slip, a sickening crack of bone, and the weight of the tree had done the rest. They told me his passing was instantaneous, a small mercy offered to a new widow. But I had seen his face frozen in a mask of surprise and pain, and that image was etched behind my eyes, a ghost that walked with me through the long, dark hours of the night. In that single brutal moment, I went from wife to widow, from a partner to the sole protector of 40 acres of stubborn, snow-choked land and a 5-year-old son. "Mama," a small voice called from the barn, thin and worried in the biting air. "Old Bess is shivering again. Thomas, my sweet Tommy." He had his father's bright auburn hair, a splash of defiant color in this monochrome world. But he had my eyes, serious gray eyes that had seen far too much for a child. "I'll bring her another blanket, sweet boy," I called back, my voice sounding brittle in the cold. I knew another blanket was a fool's comfort. The hay was running low, the grain even lower. The well was a constant battle, a hole in the earth that threatened to freeze solid each night. Every trip to chip away the ice felt like a gamble against fate. One misstep on the slick boards, one slip of the axe, and Tommy would be left an orphan in this desolate wasteland. I made my way to the well, my worn boots crunching a mournful rhythm on the packed snow. The rope was stiff with ice, burning my palms even through my woolen gloves as I lowered the bucket. I counted the seconds until I heard the dull thud against the ice, followed by the crack and the eventual sluggish splash. Too many seconds. The water level was dropping or the ice was thickening. Either way, it was a death sentence. Without water, the last of our cattle would die. They were already specters, their ribs stark beneath their winter coats, their breath pluming in the air like desperate prayers. We had started the winter with 20 head of hardy Hereford. Now only 12 remained huddled together for warmth in the lee of the barn, their lowing a constant mournful sound. Each one that fell was a nail in the coffin of my independence. Without the cattle, there would be nothing to sell in the spring. Without money, I shoved the thought away as I did 100 times a day. I hauled up the bucket, the water sloshing over the side, freezing instantly into a delicate crystalline lace. "Mrs. Vance." The voice made me jump, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mr. Abernathy, the banker from Cedar Ridge, sat in his sleigh by the gate, his city coat and beaver-pelled hat looking absurdly out of place against the raw wilderness. He was a thin man with the patient, predatory stillness of a coyote, always appearing when the scent of weakness was strongest on the wind. "Mr. Abernathy," I acknowledged, my voice flat. I didn't move to invite him closer. The cold was a convenient excuse for my lack of hospitality. "What brings you all the way out here in this concern for your welfare, of course, ma'am," he said, his smile not reaching the calculating glint in his eyes. "The bank has been reviewing its accounts. With your husband gone in this harsh winter." "My husband's death doesn't change my ability to work this land," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Fear was a cold knot in my stomach. "Of course not," he agreed far too quickly. "But a woman alone with a young child, it is a heavy burden. Perhaps you'd consider selling." Marcus Thorne has made a generous offer for all the properties along this creek, enough to set you up quite comfortably in town. You could open a small boarding house, perhaps. This land is my son's inheritance, I said, the words sharp as icicles. It is all he has left of his father. We are not selling. Abernathy's smile tightened. The next mortgage payment is due at the 1st of March, Mrs. Vance. I do hope you'll have it. He tipped his hat. And I heard you had some difficulty at the general store last week. Something about your credit being frozen until spring. Heat flooded my cheeks, a painful contrast to the biting cold. He was right. I had been turned away by Mr. Gable when trying to buy flour and salt pork told my account was past due. The shame of walking out empty-handed, of feeling the other customers' stares, a mixture of pity and judgment, still burned. Good day, Mr. Abernathy, I said, my tone a clear dismissal. After he left, the sleigh bells fading into the vast silence, I allowed myself a moment of weakness. I leaned against the frozen wood of the well, the icy splinters pressing into my back. The gossip in town was a poison. A widow trying to run a ranch was an oddity. One who wore her dead husband's trousers under her skirt to work in the snow and refused all offers of remarriage was a scandal. Just last Sunday, Mrs. Henderson had pointedly gathered her skirts and moved her family to a different pew when I sat down in church, as if my grief and my poverty might be contagious. As the pale sun began its descent, bleeding weak colors of rose and violet across the snow-covered horizon, I saw him. He was a dark speck against the glowing snow, a rider moving with a slowness that spoke of utter exhaustion. Both horse and man looked defeated by the cold. My hand moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle propped against the porch wall. In this wilderness, a stranger was a threat until proven otherwise, especially for a woman alone. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. The horse was a powerful roan, but its head was low, its coat thick with frost, and it favored its right foreleg. The rider was a big man, slumped in the saddle, his broad shoulders hunched against a wind that never ceased. His hat was pulled low, and a threadbare scarf covered the lower half of his face. His clothes, a heavy sheepskin coat worn slick with use and canvas trousers, marked him as a working man, a cowboy, or a trapper, but not one of the local hands I recognized. He stopped a respectful distance from the house, his horse's breath pluming in a great weary cloud. He pushed back his hat, and I saw a face that might have been handsome if it weren't gaunt with fatigue and chapped raw by the wind. Dark hair needing a cut fell across his forehead. But it was his eyes that held me. They were the color of a frozen lake, a pale, piercing blue that held a weariness so profound it seemed to go beyond the physical. It was the exhaustion of a soul that had traveled too many hard miles and carried too many heavy memories. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble rough from the cold and disuse. "Name Silas Cole. I apologize for the intrusion, but my horse has gone lame. We've been pushing through drifts since yesterday. I was wondering if I might trouble you for a place in your barn for the night, just to get out of this wind. I can pay." I studied him, my hand still resting on the cold steel of the rifle. His gun belt was worn, the leather cracked, but the pistol in the holster was well oiled and clean. It was the mark of a man who understood the necessity of protection, but didn't go looking for trouble. His hands resting on the saddle horn were large and calloused, covered by worn leather gloves. There was a quiet dignity in his posture, a lack of aggression, despite his rough appearance, that chipped away at my immediate suspicion. "The barn's warmer than the wind, I suppose," I said finally, my words grudging. I couldn't turn away a man in this cold. It would be tantamount to murder. Arthur would never have forgiven me for that. "But the hay is for my stock." "Understood, ma'am," he said. "I've got some oats in my saddlebag for my horse, and if you've got any work that needs doing, I'd be glad to trade my labor for a hot meal. A man can only eat so much jerky before he forgets what real food tastes like." Tommy had crept onto the porch, his small form half hidden behind my skirts, peering at the stranger. Silas noticed him and, instead of a grand gesture, simply dipped his head in a slow, respectful nod. The small acknowledgement seemed to calm the boy. "You have a fine son, ma'am," Silas observed, his voice softer now. "He has a strong look about him." The simple, honest compliment eased another fraction of my wariness. Drifters and outlaws didn't usually notice the character of a small boy. "The barn is unlocked," I said, pulling my shawl tighter. "There's a pump for water, but you'll have to break the ice. Supper's in an hour. It's only stew and not much of it." "Ma'am, after 2 days in this wind, thin stew sounds like a feast at the finest hotel in Cheyenne." He dismounted, and I saw him wince, favoring his left side as he moved. It seemed an old injury, a stiffness in his bones rather than a fresh hurt. As he led his horse toward the barn, I watched the careful, deliberate way he moved. He was alert, his gaze sweeping the property not with menace but with the ingrained habit of a man who had learned to read his surroundings for danger. Mama Tommy whispered, his small hand clutching my skirt. "Is he a bad man? I don't know yet, honey," I whispered back. "For now, he's just a cold man." As he disappeared into the barn's shadows, an odd tightness bloomed in my chest. The setting sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, and for a fleeting dangerous moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to have another pair of strong hands on this ranch, to not face every frozen morning, every howling night utterly alone. But that was a foolish thought, a luxury a widow couldn't afford. Hope was a fragile thing, easily frozen and shattered. Tomorrow the stranger would be gone, and I would still be here fighting to keep the bank, the winter, and the wilderness at bay, with nothing but my own two hands and a will that was growing as brittle as the ice on the creek. Still, as I went inside to stir the stew, I found myself adding an extra handful of dried potatoes and another cup of precious water to the pot. It was Christian charity, I told myself, a simple act of decency in a world that had shown me little of either. Nothing more. The thin light of dawn crept through the cabin's frosted window panes, casting a pale, ethereal glow across the rough-hewn floor. I'd been awake for hours, my body accustomed to rising before the Sunday, but this morning felt different. The knowledge that a stranger slept in my barn 100 feet from where my son and I lay had woven a thread of unease into my sleep, leaving an edge of sharp alertness to my usual routine. I had offered Silas Cole the shelter of the barn, and over a supper of thin stew and hard biscuits he had proven to be a man of few words. He ate with a hunger that was almost painful to watch, yet his manners were impeccable. He thanked me formally, his pale blue eyes meeting mine with a directness that was unsettling before he excused himself and returned to the cold. Through the night the wind had howled a mournful dirge, and I had lain awake the Winchester on the floor beside my bed, listening to the sounds of the storm and imagining the man in the barn. Now through a small clear patch I'd rubbed on the frozen glass I watched him. He emerged from the barn, his tall frame cutting a stark silhouette against the snow-blasted landscape. He moved to the pump, and I saw the methodical way he worked, breaking the thick ice with a tire iron before working the handle with long, smooth strokes. He splashed the frigid water on his face, the gesture so brutally simple, so elemental, that I felt a strange pang in my chest. When he looked up toward the house, his gaze sweeping over the windows, I jerked back, a ridiculous heat rising in my cheeks as if I'd been caught in some shameful act. "Mama, is that man still here?" Tommy's voice came from his small cot in the corner, muffled by his quilt. "Mr. Cole," I corrected automatically. "And yes, he is still here." "Can he stay?" he asked, sitting up. He fixed the latch on Bess's stall. "It doesn't stick anymore." My throat tightened. The latch had been broken for a month, a small thing in a sea of overwhelming repairs. I had tried to fix it myself, but my fingers had grown numb and clumsy in the cold. That this stranger had taken it upon himself to mend it without being asked was a small kindness that felt disproportionately large. "We'll see," I said, the universal answer for a mother who didn't want to say no. A firm knock at the door made me startle. I smoothed my apron, a nervous, futile gesture, and opened it. Silas stood on the porch, his hat in his hand despite the biting cold. He had brushed the snow from his coat, and his face was clean, though still marked by the wind. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," he said. "I wanted to thank you again for the shelter. I'll be moving on now, but I'd like to settle up for the meal and your trouble." "You fixed the stall latch," I said, my voice stiffer than I intended. "We're even." He held my gaze for a long moment, and I had the unnerving feeling that those pale eyes saw far too much the weariness I tried to hide, the fear I held at bay. "That lean-to roof on the north side of the barn needs work," he said, his voice quiet. "A heavy snow will bring it down. And your woodpile is getting low for this deep in the winter. Forgive me for speaking out of turn." Everything he said was true. The list of repairs, of tasks that required a man's strength, grew longer with each passing day. My own pride was a poor shield against the brutal reality of winter. "That is not your concern, Mr. Cole." "It could be," he said, shifting his weight. He seemed to be choosing his words with great care. "I'm not in a particular hurry to get anywhere. The passes will be snowed in for another month at least. If you could use an extra hand, I work for my keep. A place in the barn and a seat at your table is more than fair pay." I should have said no. I knew I should have. The whispers in town were already a plague. To have an unattached man living and working on my property, even in the barn, would be handing them a loaded gun. But then I thought of the lean-to roof heavy with snow. I thought of the dwindling woodpile and my aching back. I thought of Tommy's face when he spoke of the mended latch. Pride wouldn't keep my son warm. "I cannot pay you a wage," I said, the words tasting like surrender. I didn't ask for one. He settled his hat back on his head, the gesture sealing our unspoken agreement. "I'll start with that woodpile if that's agreeable to you." And so began an arrangement that I told myself was temporary, a matter of necessity that would last only until the first thaw. But the days bled into a week and then another. Silas Cole proved to be a quiet, relentless worker. He kept a respectful distance, never approaching the house, without an invitation, eating his meals with a quiet gratitude before retreating to the barn. He spoke when spoken to, his answers direct and thoughtful. But he never pried, never asked about Arthur or the circumstances that had left me a widow. It was Tommy who first found a crack in Silas's formidable reserve. My son, starved for a masculine presence, began to follow him around the ranch like a small, curious shadow. To my surprise, Silas answered his endless stream of questions with a patience that bordered on tenderness. One evening, as the three of us sat by the fire in the brief hour after supper, before Silas retreated, Tommy asked the question I had been too afraid to voice. "Mr. Cole," he said, his small face serious in the firelight, "were you a soldier? In the war?" The question hung in the air. I held my breath, but Silas just nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I was. A long time ago. I was just a boy myself, not much older than your mama is now." Did you hurt anyone?" Tommy whispered. "Tommy," I scolded, my voice sharp with embarrassment. But Silas held up a hand, stopping me. "It's an honest question from a boy. Yes, son. I did." His voice was heavy, laden with a sorrow so deep it seemed to absorb the light from the room. "And it's a thing I carry every day. The war makes men do things they spend the rest of their lives trying to understand." I saw the shadows that crossed his face, then the ghosts that looked out from behind his eyes, and I understood a little more of the bone-deep weariness he carried. I had been a girl of 16 when the war ended, and I remembered the men who had come home, or the pieces of them that had. The next morning, trouble arrived in a sleigh. I recognized it at once, Reverend Miller with Bob Hutchkins, who ran the town's only saloon, and Carl Meyer from the general store huddled beside him, a delegation of town morality. I smoothed my apron, lifted my chin, and stepped onto the porch to meet them, the cold air, a welcome shock to my senses. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice as crisp as the frozen air. Hutchkins, a large man whose face was perpetually flushed from his own wares, spoke first, his voice a belligerent boom. "We heard you've taken on a hired man, Widow Vance. I have help with the repairs." "Yes," I said coolly. "A man living in your barn, eating at your table." Meyer added, his thin face pinched with a sour disapproval. "Eleanor, people are talking." "People always talk, Carl," I replied, my patience wearing thin. "I have yet to see their gossip chop my wood or keep my son from freezing." Reverend Miller stepped forward, his expression a practiced mask of sanctimonious concern. "My dear Mrs. Vance, we are only thinking of your reputation, of the boy's upbringing. A young widow, a stranger of unknown character. Surely you can see how this appears." "What I see, Reverend," I said, my voice sharp now, cutting through his condescension, "is that none of you offered to help when my roof was leaking or my cattle were starving. Mr. Cole works for his keep, nothing more. He has been a gentleman in every respect. Now see here," Hutchkins began, stepping forward threateningly. He stopped dead as Silas appeared around the corner of the house. He held a splitting maul in one hand, its weight resting comfortably in his grip. He had clearly heard every word. "Gentlemen," Silas said, his voice mild, almost conversational. But there was something in his stance, a perfect, coiled stillness that made all three men take an involuntary step back. "Fine morning for a visit. I was just about to split some kindling for Mrs. Vance. Unless you were here to lend a hand, I'd best get to it. The cold doesn't wait." A tense silence descended. Silas stood there, relaxed but utterly ready. In that moment, I realized with a jolt that this quiet, reserved man was more dangerous than all three of these town bullies combined. This was a man who had faced down far worse than their petty judgments. "We were only expressing our Christian concern," the Reverend said, his voice losing its authoritative tone. He was already backing toward the sleigh. "I'm sure you were," Silas replied, his eyes never leaving them. "And I'm certain Mrs. Vance appreciates having such watchful neighbors. Good day to you." After they left a flurry of angry whispers and resentful glares, I found that my hands were shaking not from the cold but from rage. "They will make trouble for you," I said, my voice low. Perhaps Silas agreed, leaning the maul against the cabin wall. But I've found that men who travel in packs to intimidate a woman alone usually have very little courage when they're faced one-on-one. He paused, then looked at me, his gaze serious. "If my being here brings you more grief than help, Eleanor, I will leave. You only have to say the word. Number." The word escaped my lips before I could think sharp and definite. I cleared my throat, embarrassed by my own intensity. That is, there is still the matter of the lean-to roof. That evening, a fragile truce seemed to settle between us. After Tommy was asleep, we sat by the fire, the silence comfortable rather than strained. He told me a little of his story then. He'd had a farm in Ohio, a wife named Sarah. She'd been taken by consumption while he was away on a long cattle drive south. He'd come home to a fresh grave in a silent house. He sold the farm, unable to bear the ghosts that walked its rooms, and had been drifting ever since. 5 years now, he said, his voice a low murmur, his eyes lost in the dancing flames. I thought I was looking for something, a new start. But maybe I was just running. Sometimes running is all a person can do, I said softly, the words an echo of my own heart. When Arthur died, I wanted to run. Pack up Tommy and go back east to my sister in Boston. But this land, it's all my son has of his father. "It's good land," Silas said, his gaze lifting from the fire to meet mine. "It's worth fighting for, even against the winter and debt and the petty minds in town. Especially then." He held my gaze and something unspoken passed between us. "You are a stronger woman than you know, Eleanor Vance." It was the first time he had used my given name. It felt both startlingly intimate and perfectly natural. A current warm and alive passed between us in the firelit stillness. I was the first to look away, rising abruptly, my heart beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "It's late," I said, my voice husky. But as I lay in my bed that night, the wind rattling the shutters, I found I wasn't thinking of Arthur's frozen face for the first time in a year. Instead, I thought of pale blue eyes that saw too much of the quiet strength in Silas's hands as he worked, and of the surprising gentleness in his voice when he spoke to my son. For the first time in a very long time, I did not dream of death. I dreamed of the steady rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, a sound as constant and reassuring as a heartbeat, promising that some things, even a heart frozen by grief, could still be mended. The next morning I made biscuits, and I opened a precious jar of strawberry preserves, setting a generous spoonful on Silas's plate. It was a small, simple gesture, but when he looked up and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached all the way to his weary eyes, I felt something deep inside my chest crack open like frozen earth finally yielding to the first hint of a thaw. Hope, I realized with a terrifying jolt. I was beginning to hope again. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the demands of survival. The cold did not relent. If anything, it deepened its hold, sinking its teeth into the very bones of the land. But with Silas here, the crushing weight of solitude had lifted. The ranch, once a landscape of my despair, began to feel like a place we were fighting for together. There was a simple, profound comfort in hearing the rhythmic swing of his axe in the mornings, a sound that spoke of warmth and safety. He repaired the lean-to roof, his movements economical and sure. He reinforced the corral, his hands working with a practiced skill that was mesmerizing to watch. We spoke little during the day, our energies consumed by the relentless labor. But in the evenings, after Tommy was tucked into his cot, a quiet companionship bloomed in the warmth of the cabin. We would sit by the fire, the howling wind a distant counterpoint to the crackling flames, and the silence between us would slowly fill with stories. He told me of his boyhood in Ohio, of a farm with green fields, and a river full of fish a world away from this frozen expanse. He spoke of the war with a heavy reluctance, not of battles or glory, but of the crushing boredom, the gnawing fear, and the faces of the boys he'd known who never came home. He never spoke of killing, but the sorrow in his voice was a testament to the things he left unsaid. And I, in turn, found myself speaking of Arthur. Not of the accident, not of the grief, but of the man he was. Of his easy laugh, of the way he'd dreamed of filling this valley with 1,000 head of cattle, of the silly off-key songs he'd sing to Tommy. Talking about him with Silas didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like an honoring. Silas listened with a quiet, unwavering attention that made me feel seen, truly seen for the first time in a year. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the very foundations of the cabin, he looked at my hands, which were busy mending a tear in Tommy's coat. Your hands tell a story of hard work, Eleanor, he said, his voice a low rumble. I stopped looking down at my own chapped, calloused fingers. They're not a lady's hands anymore. No, he said, his pale eyes holding mine. They're a survivor's hands. They're more beautiful for it. My breath caught in my throat. The simple, direct sincerity of his words sent a jolt of warmth through me that had nothing to do with the fire. It was in these small moments that the foundations of something new and terrifying were being laid. An awareness of him as a man, not just a hired hand, grew in the spaces between our words. I found my eyes lingering on the breadth of his shoulders, on the quiet strength of his hands, on the way the firelight caught the silver threads at his temples. A dangerous, unfamiliar longing began to stir in the frozen depths of my heart. The cattle were the constant gnawing worry that underscored our every action. The last of the hay was nearly gone, and the herd was growing weaker by the day. We'll lose them all if they stay here, Silas, said one evening, his voice grim as he stared out the window at the huddled shapes in the snow. There's a sheltered valley about a day's ride south. Box Canyon. The snow isn't as deep there, and there might be some winter grass. The wind is kept clear. A day's ride. The thought was daunting. The cattle were in no condition for such a journey. We could lose half of them just getting there. We'll lose all of them if we don't try, he said simply. It's a risk, but it's the only one we've got. He paused, his gaze meeting mine. I can manage them. You should stay here with the boy. A year ago I would have deferred, but this year had taught me that my survival and my son's depended on my own strength. No, I said the word firm. They are my cattle, my responsibility. We go together or not at all. He studied me for a long moment, a flicker of something respect perhaps in his eyes. All right, Eleanor. Together. We spent the next day preparing. I arranged for Tommy to stay with the Olsons, our nearest neighbors, a stoic Swedish couple who kept to themselves but remembered Arthur helping them raise their barn. Helga Olson, a woman with a face as weathered as the landscape, had simply nodded when I asked, her eyes conveying a depth of understanding that needed no words. Leaving Tommy was the hardest thing I'd ever done. He clung to me, his small face buried in my skirts, his body trembling. You will come back, Mama, he whispered, his voice thick with a fear too big for his small frame. I knelt in the snow, pulling him into a fierce hug, my own heart aching. I will always come back to you, sweet boy. Always. We left before dawn, the world a landscape of blue shadows and frozen silence. The cattle moved with a painful reluctance, their breath crystallizing in the frigid air. The first day was a brutal, soul-crushing trek through waist-deep drifts and over wind-scoured ridges. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that stalked us seeking any weakness. By nightfall, we had lost 2 of the weakest heifers. I felt each loss like a physical blow. We made camp in the shelter of a rock outcropping. As Silas built a small, careful fire, I saw to the horses, my movements stiff and clumsy with exhaustion. The sky above was a canvas of impossible, brilliant stars. A cold, majestic beauty that was a stark contrast to our desperate struggle below. You handle this work like you were born to it, Silas observed, passing me a tin cup of coffee so strong and bitter it felt like a medicine. My father taught me, I said, cradling the cup for its warmth. He believed a woman should know how to do everything a man could. Said it was the only way to be truly free. I paused, the memory bringing a sad smile. Arthur. He never quite approved. He wanted a wife to keep his home, not mend his fences. Then Arthur was a fool about some things, Silas said bluntly. He immediately looked regretful. Forgive me. I shouldn't speak ill of your husband. He is dead, I said, a surprising lack of emotion in my voice. The old hurt was still there, but it was a distant ache now. And you are right. He was a good man, but he was a fool about that. He wanted a gentle dove and got a hawk instead. He got a woman who could save his legacy when he no longer could. Silas corrected, his voice low and intense. That's worth more than all the fine sewing in the world. We sat in a comfortable silence, a new level of understanding passing between us. It was then that we heard it, the crunch of hooves on snow, moving with a confidence that was not born of exhaustion. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his body transformed. The weary ranch hand was gone, replaced by something coiled and dangerous. His hand hovered over the butt of his pistol, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Well, now ain't this a cozy picture? The voice was slick with a casual menace. 3 riders emerged into the fire's glow. My heart sank. I recognized the leader immediately. Jedediah Stone. A hard man who worked as Marcus Thorne's foreman, though everyone knew his real job was intimidation and enforcement. He had a reputation for cruelty that was as sharp and cold as the winter wind. Evening, Jed Silas said, his voice deceptively calm. His posture had loosened, yet somehow he seemed more threatening. Silas Colestone said, a slow, ugly grin spreading across his face, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. I heard Thorne had a squatter problem out this way. Didn't figure it'd be you. Still picking up strays, I see. His eyes raked over me, insolent and appraising, making my skin crawl with a mixture of fear and fury. This your new woman, Cole Thorne, ain't gonna like you poaching on his territory. The lady and I are moving her cattle, Silas, said his voice dropping to a deadly even pitch. We want no trouble. Cattle, one of Stone's men sneered, a wiry youth with mean, empty eyes. You call these walking boneyards cattle, hardly worth the effort of stealing. He looked at me again. Though maybe there's other things out here worth taking. I stood slowly, my own hand moving to the rifle resting on my saddle. You are on my land, Mr. Stone. I'll thank you to move along. Your land, Stone mocked, his laugh a harsh grating sound. The way I hear it, this is Thorne's land. You're just keeping it warm for him. Maybe you need a real man to show you how to run a ranch, widow. A woman alone gets lonely. What happened next was so fast I almost didn't see it. Silas didn't move like a man. He moved like lightning. His gun was out of its holster and firing in a single fluid motion that was both terrifying and beautiful. Stone's hat flew from his head, a neat black hole punched through the crown. The next one goes lower, Jed Silas said, his voice as calm and conversational as if he were discussing the weather. The lady asked you to leave. For a heart-stopping moment, violence hung in the air, thick and palpable. Stone's face was a mask of pure murderous rage. His hand twitched towards his own gun. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached down and retrieved his hat from the snow. This ain't over, Cole, he snarled. He stared at me, his eyes promising retribution. And it ain't over for you neither. After they had galloped away into the darkness, I found I was trembling so violently I could barely stand. Silas holstered his pistol and turned to me, his hands gently gripping my shoulders. Are you all right, Eleanor? You knew him, I stammered, my mind reeling. Silas's jaw tightened, his face grim in the firelight. We have a history. From my drifting days. He worked for a man I had a disagreement with. Will he be back? The question was a whisper. Men like Jed Stone are cowards, he said. But they're vengeful cowards. We'll keep watch tonight. We took turns standing guard, the rifle and the pistol, our only companions in the vast hostile darkness. As dawn broke, we got the cattle moving again, a new urgency in our steps. We were no longer just racing against the winter. We were racing against the malice of men. It was midday when we finally reached the canyon. The sight of the sheltered valley floor where the wind had swept the snow into great drifts, leaving patches of cured brown grass exposed, was so beautiful it made me want to weep. The cattle, smelling the grass and the open water of a spring-fed creek, found a new surge of strength. I laughed, a raw, cracked sound of pure relief as they stumbled forward. We made it, Silas, I breathed the words, catching in my throat. We did, he agreed, but his eyes never stopped scanning the canyon rim, watchful and alert. We spent the afternoon letting the cattle graze their desperate hunger, a painful thing to witness. As evening approached, we made camp on a high ledge overlooking the valley, a defensible position. The encounter with Stone had shattered any illusion of safety. As we sat by the fire, the shared danger and the profound relief of reaching the canyon had stripped away our final reserves. My wife, Sarah, Silas said suddenly, his voice soft with memory and pain. She was strong like you. She wasn't afraid of work. She wasn't afraid of anything except the sickness that took her. When she died, I felt like my own soul had been ripped out. I blamed myself. I was away when she took her final turn. I sold everything and just ran. I figured I didn't deserve a second chance, didn't deserve a home. He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a grief so raw it mirrored my own. But then I rode up to a widow's cabin in the middle of a blizzard, and I found someone fighting the whole damn world with nothing but grit and a rifle just to keep a home for her son. It made me think that maybe running isn't the answer. That maybe standing your ground and fighting for something that matters. That's the only thing that island. The air between us crackled with an unspoken emotion, a connection forged in hardship and mutual respect. Without thinking, I reached across the small space between us and laid my hand on his. He turned his palm up, his calloused fingers intertwining with mine. His touch was warm, solid, and incredibly gentle. "Silas," I whispered, my voice thick. "I know," he said, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "I know all the reasons this is a mistake, all the trouble it will bring you." But Eleanor, I closed. A shot rang out the crack, echoing through the canyon, shattering the night. Silas reacted without thought, throwing his body over mine, pulling me down behind the rocks as more bullets whined overhead, sparking against the stone. The cattle, spooked, began to bellow and stampede in the valley below. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice a harsh command. He drew his pistol, firing back toward the muzzle flashes that blossomed like deadly flowers on the opposite canyon rim. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, terrified bird. I crawled to my rifle, the cold steel a grim comfort. I could hear them now, the shouts of men, the thunder of hooves. Stone had come back, and he hadn't come back alone. A bullet ricocheted off a rock near my head, showering my face with stone chips. I raised the Winchester, sighted down the barrel as Arthur had taught me, and fired back. The firefight was a chaotic, terrifying blur of noise and flashing light. But in the midst of it, I saw Silas move with a deadly calm, a cool precision that was breathtaking. He made every shot count, his movements economical and lethal. I found a rhythm of my own loading and firing, keeping them from flanking our position. Then a scream of pain cut through the night, followed by Stone's voice, cursing and furious. "Fall back, damn you, Cole, fall back." The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Silas remained crouched, his pistol ready for long, silent minutes before he finally straightened. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice urgent. His hands ran over my arms, my shoulders, a frantic, searching touch. "Number? I'm fine." "Are you?" "I'm fine." He pulled me against him then, a sudden, desperate embrace, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. His body was tense, vibrating with the aftermath of battle. "Damn brave woman, Eleanor Vance," he whispered into my hair. "Damn brave." I clung to him, burying my face in the rough wool of his coat, breathing in the scent of wood smoke, leather, and gunpowder. I could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against my cheek, a rhythm that slowly calmed my own. When he finally pulled back to look at me, the moonlight silvering the sharp planes of his face, I saw something in his eyes that stole my breath. It was a raw, fierce possession, a look that claimed me as his. He lowered his head, and I lifted my face to meet his. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate, hungry, a collision of two souls who had just faced death together. It was a kiss that tasted of fear and relief, of gunpowder and the cold night air. It was a brand, a promise, a declaration made in the heart of the wilderness with only the silent stars as witness. When we finally broke apart, gasping for breath, the world had shifted. The line we had so carefully walked had been obliterated. There was no going back. The sun was rising by the time we'd rounded up the scattered, terrified cattle and moved our camp to a more defensible position deep within the canyon. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a new, unspoken intimacy. "Stone won't give up, Silas," said his voice flat as he cleaned his pistol. "A man like that can't stand to be beaten, especially not by a woman and a man he considers his inferior." "Then we will be ready for him," I said, a new hardness in my own voice. I looked at this man, this stranger who had risked his life for me, who had awakened feelings I thought were buried forever with Arthur. I was no longer just a widow fighting for survival. I was a woman fighting for a future I had just begun to believe was possible. "Together," Silas said, and he smiled then. Not his usual guarded smile, but a real one, full of warmth and a fierce protective light. "Together," I agreed. As we began the long journey home 2 days later, the cattle stronger, our purpose clearer, I knew something fundamental had changed within me. I was no longer fighting alone, and that I was beginning to realize made all the difference in the world. Word of the firefight in Box Canyon, twisted and magnified by rumor, reached Cedar Ridge before we did. As we drove the small recovering herd into the corral, I could feel the eyes on us. Curtains twitched in the windows of the few neighboring ranches we passed. By evening, I knew the story would be all over town. The scandalous widow Sullivan, not content with merely housing a drifter, had now taken to riding the range with him, engaging in gun battles like some common outlaw. The truth was far more complicated and far more intimate, a secret we now held between us. "Let me take Tommy into town for supplies tomorrow," Silas suggested, as we unsaddled the exhausted horses in the frigid twilight. "It might be best if you lay low for a few days. Let the talk die down." My hand stilled on the saddle buckle. "I will not hide in my own home, Silas. I have done nothing shameful." "This isn't about shame, Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's about strategy. It's about not giving men like Thorne and Abernathy more ammunition to use against you. I turned to face him, the last light of day catching the weary lines on his face. My chin went up. I have been choosing my battles since the day Arthur died. I will not start running from them now. He studied me for a long moment, those pale eyes seeming to see straight into the stubborn core of my soul. Stubborn woman, he murmured, but there was a deep current of admiration in his voice that warmed me more than any fire. That night after I'd returned from the Olsons with a tired but happy Tommy, the boy was full of questions. I censored the most dangerous parts of our journey, but Silas, to my surprise, entertained him with tales of the canyon, of the wily coyotes they'd outsmarted, and the stars that felt close enough to touch. Watching them together by the fire, Silas patiently showing Tommy how to whittle a piece of scrap wood into a clumsy-looking bird, the boy's face wrapped with adoration, made something deep in my chest ache with a complex mix of joy and sorrow. This was the fatherhood Tommy had been robbed of. This was the partnership I had craved. After Tommy was asleep, I found Silas on the porch, rifle across his lap, keeping watch as had become his habit. The moon was a perfect cold disk in the black sky, bathing the endless snow in a ghostly silver light. "You don't have to stand guard every night," I said softly, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. "Yes, I do." He accepted the mug, his fingers brushing against mine. The brief contact sent a shockwave up my arm. Jed Stone is out there, and he's not the type to forgive or forget. We stood in silence, listening to the profound quiet of the winter night, the only sounds the sigh of the wind and the distant howl of a lone wolf. "Reverend Miller came by while we were gone," I said finally. "Helga Olson told me. He said he would be calling again tomorrow to discuss my spiritual and moral welfare." Silas's jaw tightened. I saw the muscles clench under his skin. "Do you want me to make myself scarce number?" The word was a bullet, sharp and final. I was tired of pretending, tired of the lies I told myself and the world. I set my own mug down on the railing and turned to face him fully. "I am tired of acting as if you are nothing more than a hired hand, Silas. I am tired of the shame the town wants me to feel when what I truly feel is—" I faltered the words, catching in my throat, afraid to give them voice. "When what, Eleanor?" His voice was a low, dangerous whisper in the darkness, pulling the truth from me. "When I lie awake in my own bed and think of you out here in the cold. When I watch you with my son and I wish, God help me, I wish things were different." My confession hung between us, fragile and terrifying. "Eleanor." My name was a groan, a sound of tormented longing from his lips. He took a step closer, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the frozen air. "You know what they will say. You know the trouble this will bring down on you." "They are already saying it," I whispered, my voice trembling. I took the final step, closing the distance between us, my hands coming up to rest on the rough sheepskin of his coat. "I have been a good widow, Silas. I have worn my black dress and kept my head down. I have mourned, and I have worked, and I have been so terribly, terribly alone. I am 27 years old, and I feel like I have already lived a lifetime. I don't know if I have the strength to be that lonely anymore." He set his mug aside with a sharp clink of metal on wood. His hands came up not to touch me, but to frame my face, his calloused thumbs stroking my cheeks with an infinite, surprising gentleness. His eyes in the moonlight were dark pools of emotion. "Are you sure about this, Eleanor? Because once we cross this line, there is no going back. Not for me." Instead of answering, I rose on my toes and pressed my lips to his. It was not like the desperate, frantic kiss in the canyon. This was hesitant at first, a question asked in the winter dark. Then as his arms came around me, pulling me tight against his solid frame, it deepened into something else entirely. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, of a shared loneliness, so deep it felt like coming home. I could taste the bitter coffee and the cold night on his lips, and something that was uniquely, intoxicatingly him. My head spun, the world narrowing to this single breathtaking point of contact. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. "Woman," he breathed, his voice ragged, "you are going to be the undoing of me." "I hope not," I whispered back, my own voice unsteady. "I've already buried one man. I don't think my heart could bear to bury another." The next morning, as predicted, brought Reverend Miller. He was not alone. Mrs. Henderson, the self-appointed guardian of town morality, sat beside him in the sleigh, along with Elijah Abernathy from the bank. A tribunal. I met them on the porch. I had deliberately chosen my worn practical trousers, and a simple woolen shirt forgoing my widow's black. Silas stood beside me, not behind me. He was clean-shaven, his hair combed, but there was an unyielding hardness in his stance that made it clear he was not cowed by their presence. Mrs. Vance, the Reverend began, his face pinched with a righteous disapproval that barely masked a prurient curiosity. We have come as a matter of Christian duty to discuss the irregularities of this household. What irregularities would those be, Reverend? I asked, my voice calm and even. Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman who wielded gossip like a weapon, leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. Do not play the innocent with us, Eleanor Vance. The entire county knows you've been living in sin with this drifter. This drifter has a name. Silas said, his voice mild but carrying a weight that made Mrs. Henderson flinch. And I will ask you to speak to Mrs. Vance with the respect she is due. Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound dry and reptilian. The bank has serious concerns about the stability of your situation, Mrs. Vance. A loan was made to a family, to an unmarried woman with no male protector under these morally ambiguous circumstances. I was not aware that my marital status or your moral judgment affected my ability to repay a debt, Mr. Abernathy, I said sharply. The payment is not due for another month. Yes, but given the questions of character that have arisen, Abernathy trailed off, letting the insinuation hang in the air. My dear child, the Reverend interjected, adopting a tone of patronizing pity that set my teeth on edge. We are only thinking of your immortal soul and the welfare of your son. What kind of example are you setting for the boy? I am setting an example of hard work and perseverance, I replied, my voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even me. I am setting an example of not surrendering when life becomes unbearable. I am setting an example of choosing a good man's help over a hypocrite's judgment. An example of fornication, Mrs. Henderson burst out, her face mottled with rage. You are living in sin with a man who is not your husband. Silas took a half-step forward, and the instinctive predatory grace of the movement made all three of them shrink back. Ma'am, he said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper, I would be exceptionally careful about making accusations you cannot prove. Where I come from, calling a lady such names has consequences. Are you threatening us, sir? The Reverend demanded, puffing out his chest. Stating a fact, Reverend Silas said calmly. Mrs. Vance is a widow fighting to save her son's inheritance. I am a man working for room and board. Anything else is a product of your own small, dirty minds, and it says far more about you than it does about us. Before anyone could retort, the sound of approaching riders interrupted the tense standoff. My heart sank as I saw Marcus Thorne himself, flanked by Jedediah Stone and 4 other hard-faced men. Thorne, a man whose wealth had been built on the misfortunes of others, reigned in his magnificent black stallion. He exuded an aura of arrogant power. Well, Thorne called out, his voice booming with false bonhomie. Looks like a regular town meeting. Am I interrupting something important? He looked from the Reverend's party to me and Silas, a smug, knowing smirk on his face. Mr. Thorne, the Reverend stammered, clearly intimidated. We were just counseling Mrs. Vance. Counseling her to sell, I hope. Thorne said, his eyes cold and gray as a winter sky, fixing on me. I hear you've had more trouble, Eleanor. Gunfights. A shame. This is no life for a lady. His gaze flicked to Silas, contemptuous and dismissive, especially with the company you're keeping. Jed Stone leaned forward in his saddle, his grin a malevolent slash. Told you we'd see you again, Cole. Didn't expect to find you playing housemaid to a desperate widow. I saw Silas's hands clench into fists at his sides, but his voice remained steady. Thorne, I'd heard you were trying to squeeze the small ranchers out of this valley. I see the rumors are true. It's not squeezing, Cole. It's progress, Thorne said smoothly. This valley needs a single strong hand to guide it, not a patchwork of failing homesteads run by women and drifters. He turned his attention back to me, his voice hardening. I'm making you one last offer, Eleanor. $500. Cash. For this worthless patch of snow. It's more than you'll see when the bank forecloses next month. The land is not for sale, I said, the words a familiar refrain. You're a fool, Thorne said, his mask of civility finally dropping. He gestured at Jedstone. Maybe my foreman can explain the realities of the situation to you more clearly. Stone dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked toward the porch, his spurs ringing a death knell on the frozen ground. The boss is being generous, widow. You should take his offer. It'd be a real shame if something else unfortunate were to happen. A fire, maybe. In this cold, a fire can get out of hand real fast, especially a barn full of what little hay you got left. The threat was naked, brutal, and delivered in front of the Reverend and the town's banker. I looked at them, a silent appeal. Reverend Miller looked at his feet. Mrs. Henderson looked away. Abernathy simply watched, his face a blank mask. They were complicit. They were cowards. "You have 10 seconds to get off this land, Stone," Silas said. His voice was devoid of all emotion, which made it the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. He had moved, placing himself squarely between me and Stone. Stone laughed. "Or what, Cole, you gonna shoot me in front of all these fine people? I don't need to shoot you to break you in half," Silas said. "But if you take one more step onto this porch, I will." Something in Silas's tone and his absolute stillness must have penetrated even Stone's thick skull. He stopped his bravado, faltering for a fraction of a second. He glanced back at Thorne, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "You heard the man," Thorne called out, his voice laced with amusement. "He's defending his woman's honor. Very noble." He gathered his reins. "But nobility doesn't pay the bills, Eleanor. You have until the 1st of March. After that, this land is mine, one way or another." As they all rode away, a vile posse of greed and hypocrisy, I sank onto the top step of the porch, a tremor running through my entire body that had nothing to do with the cold. Silas sat beside me, not touching, but his presence was a solid, reassuring wall against the world. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he said quietly. "My past, my trouble with men like that, it's brought this down on you." "No," I said, my voice fierce. I turned to look at him, at this man who had stood ready to fight for me, for my home. "This was coming long before you arrived. You didn't bring the storm, Silas. You're just the first person who's been willing to stand in it with me." That night, after Tommy was asleep, a new storm rolled in from the north, a blizzard of terrifying intensity. The wind screamed like a banshee, and the snow fell so thick it erased the world. The cabin, which had once felt like a prison of my grief, now felt like a sanctuary, a tiny bastion of warmth and light against the raging darkness. There was a soft knock on my bedroom door. I opened it to find Silas standing there, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice barely a whisper over the roar of the wind. "The storm is making the horses nervous." I thought. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I knew I should send him back to his chair by the fire. I knew what propriety demanded. But propriety was a luxury for a different world, for a different woman. I stepped back from the door, an unspoken invitation. He entered the small room, and the space was suddenly charged, filled with the energy of all the things we hadn't said, all the feelings we had held back. The storm raged outside, a reflection of the tempest in my own heart. He reached for me then, and I went into his arms as if I had been walking toward them my entire life. His kiss was everything. The world outside was not. It was warmth and safety and a desperate, searing passion that melted the last of the ice around my heart. "Eleanor," he breathed against my lips, his voice ragged with an emotion that mirrored my own. "Tell me to go. Tell me to leave you be. Stay," I whispered the word of prayer. "Please, Silas, stay." He pulled back his hands, framing my face, his pale eyes dark with a desire so profound it felt like a sacred vow. "I'd give 10 herds of prize cattle, Eleanor. I'd give everything I ever owned just for the right to stand with you. To love you. You don't have to give anything," I said, my own voice thick with unshed tears. "Just stay." And he did. Outside, the blizzard howled its fury, but inside my small cabin, in the heart of the unrelenting winter, there was only the warmth of whispered promises and the defiant, unquenchable bloom of a love I had never thought to feel again. He held me through the long, dark night, his body a shield against the cold. And I, who had thought my heart was buried under a year of snow, discovered that it had only been sleeping, waiting for a drifter with sad eyes and gentle hands to come and wake it from its winter slumber. Dawn came, but the blizzard did not relent. It was a whiteout, a world without horizons, where the sky and the earth had merged into a single churning vortex of snow and wind. The cabin groaned under the weight of the storm, and for 2 days we were prisoners, the 3 of us sealed in our tiny wooden fortress. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the roar of the wind, the warmth of the fire, and the new fragile intimacy that enveloped us. It was a strange, suspended time. The threats from Thorne and the town seemed a distant echo. In the enforced stillness, we became a family. Silas and Tommy built elaborate forts with blankets and chairs, their laughter a bright, defiant sound against the storm's fury. Silas taught him how to play checkers with pieces whittled from wood, and I watched them, a fierce protective love swelling in my chest until it felt as if my ribs might break. In the quiet moments when Tommy was asleep, Silas and I talked. We talked for hours, the words pouring out of us as if a dam had broken. He told me of Sarah, of their youthful dreams, and the quiet, creeping horror of her illness. He spoke of the guilt that had driven him into the wilderness, a self-imposed penance for not being there when she died. I thought if I kept moving, the memories couldn't catch me. He confessed, his eyes lost in the fire. But they're faster than any horse. They were always with me. Grief is a ghost that shares your bed, I whispered. The truth of it, a raw ache in my throat. It's always there when you wake in the morning. But it's quieter now, he said, turning his gaze to me. Since I came here. Since you. His hand found mine in the firelight, his fingers lacing through my own. It was a simple, solid connection, an anchor in the storm. We didn't speak of love, not in words. The word was too small for the vast, complex emotion that was growing between us. It was a thing born of shared hardship, of mutual respect, and a desperate elemental need. It was a bond forged in the heart of the fire, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that it was unbreakable. On the third morning, we woke to a world transformed. The wind had died, leaving behind a profound crystalline silence. The sun was brilliant in a sky of impossible blue, and the new snow lay in massive sculpted drifts, sparkling with 1 billion tiny diamonds. It was a landscape of breathtaking, lethal beauty. The devastation became apparent as soon as we opened the door. The snow was piled halfway up the cabin walls. The lean-to on the north side of the barn had collapsed just as Silas had predicted. The weight of the snow had been too much. The horses, I breathed, my heart seizing with panic. We spent the next hour digging a tunnel to the barn, the work grueling and frantic. When we finally forced the door open, we were met with a scene of chaos. The 3 remaining horses and the mule were panicked, their eyes wild. One of Arthur's geldings had a deep gash on its flank from a fallen timber. But they were alive. All of them. The relief was so profound it left me weak-kneed. As Silas worked to calm the animals and tend to the injured horse, his voice a low, soothing murmur, I began the back-breaking work of shoveling out the barn and assessing the damage. The loss of the lean-to was a serious blow. It was where I had stored what little hay we had left. Now it was buried under tons of snow, likely ruined. We worked all day, a desperate, silent team. The physical labor was a blessing, a way to channel the fear and the rising tide of despair. By nightfall, we had cleared a path, secured the animals, and salvaged what we could of the hay. It wasn't much. That night, as we sat exhausted by the fire, the reality of our situation settled over us like a shroud. We're almost out of feed, I said, my voice flat. And my credit is no good in town. Even if I could get there. I have a little money saved, Silas said. From my last job. It's not much, but it might be enough to buy a few bales from the Olsons. I won't take your money, Silas, I said, shaking my head. You've already done too much. Eleanor, he said, his voice firm, cutting through my pride. There is no your money and my money anymore, not for me. What I have is yours. It's ours. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch, placing it on the table between us. It's not a gift. It's an investment. In this ranch. In us. His words, his simple, unwavering faith in a future I could barely dare to imagine, broke something inside me. The tears I had held back for a year through Arthur's death, through the loneliness, through the fear, finally fell. I buried my face in my hands and my body was racked with great shuddering sobs. Silas didn't speak. He simply moved from his chair and knelt before me, his arms gathering me into a strong, solid embrace. He held me as I wept, his hand stroking my hair, his presence. A silent, steadfast comfort until the storm inside me had passed. When I finally quieted, my face buried against his chest, he spoke, his voice a low rumble against my ear. That woman who faced down Jedstone's guns, who dug her way through a mountain of snow to save her horses, that woman has nothing to cry for. She's the strongest person I've ever known. He pulled back his hands, framing my tear-stained face. And she's not alone anymore. Tommy, awakened by my sobs, had padded out from his room, his small face etched with worry. He looked at us, his eyes wide, and then he walked over and wrapped his small arms around both our necks, his body a warm, solid link between us. Don't go away again, Silas, the boy whispered, his voice solemn. We need you. Silas's eyes, full of a fierce protective tenderness, never left mine as he answered. I'm not going anywhere, son. Your mama's stuck with me now. Despite the smoking ruins of our hopes, the impossible debt, and the very real threat of losing everything, a spark of hope rekindled in the ashes of my despair. I leaned into Silas's touch, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. "All right," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "We fight." "We fight," he agreed. Then, despite my tear-streaked face and Tommy's watchful eyes, he kissed me. It was a kiss of promise, a declaration of war against the forces that sought to tear us apart. The next day, Silas made the treacherous journey to the Olsons' ranch. He returned at dusk, his face grim, with only 2 bales of hay tied to his saddle. It was all Lars could spare, he said, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Thorn has bought up nearly all the surplus feed in the county. He's trying to starve us out, Eleanor. It's a siege." The cold, calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Marcus Thorn wasn't just trying to buy my land. He was trying to destroy my life, to grind me into the dust until I had no choice but to surrender. A new kind of anger, cold and hard as steel, began to form in my heart. That night I woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment I was disoriented, my mind thick with sleep. Then the smell registered, acrid, greasy smoke. And with it a sound, a terrifying, hungry roar that was not the wind. "Fire!" I screamed the word. As I leaped from the bed, my heart instantly, a frantic drum against my ribs. I grabbed Tommy, who was already sitting up, his eyes wide with terror, and ran for the door. Outside, the night was lit with a hellish orange glow. The barn was an inferno. Flames licked at the sky, devouring the dry wood with a terrifying speed, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the snow. And from inside came the sound of pure terror, the high, panicked screaming of the horses trapped in the blaze. Without a second thought, I thrust Tommy toward the porch. "Stay here, do not move." Then I ran. I grabbed a horse blanket from the line, dunked it in the icy water of the trough, and threw it over my head. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that drove the air from my lungs. The smoke was a choking, blinding poison, but I could hear Bess, my sweet mare, her terrified whinnies, a knife in my heart. I fumbled with the main door latch, the metal searingly hot even through my gloves. I wrenched it open and plunged into the inferno. It was a vision of hell. The air was thick with smoke and flying embers. The roar of the fire was deafening. I could barely see my eyes, streaming, my lungs on fire. I found Bess's stall, her eyes rolling with terror. I worked the latch, my fingers clumsy and numb, and pulled her out, slapping her flank to drive her toward the open door. Then the mule. Then the gelding. I drove them out into the snow, their panicked shapes dark against the blaze. Just as I turned to get out myself, a massive burning beam from the hayloft crashed down, blocking my path, showering me with a cascade of sparks that set my sleeves smoldering. I stumbled back, disoriented, choking the heat unbearable. I was trapped. This is it, I thought, a strange, calm certainty settling over me. This is how it ends. Then through the roar and the smoke, a figure appeared in the doorway, a dark specter against the flames. Strong arms grabbed me, hauling me backward, dragging me bodily from the inferno. "Damn fool woman." The voice was a raw, furious roar of fear and rage. It was Silas. He dragged me clear of the collapsing barn, and we fell together into the snow, both of us coughing, gasping our lungs, screaming for clean air. "Silas," I choked my voice, a raw whisper. I could barely see him through the tears and the smoke. "How?" "Saw the glow from the ridge," he gasped, his arms tightening around me, his hands shaking as they moved over me, checking for burns. "I was on my way back from town." "Eleanor, what in God's name were you thinking?" "The horses." "To hell with the horses," he roared, his face a mask of fury and terror. He pulled me against him, crushing me in an embrace that was almost painful. "You could have died. You could have died. But I didn't," I whispered, clinging to him as the last of my strength gave out. We fought the fire with buckets of snow and wet blankets, a desperate, hopeless battle against the raging beast. But it was no use. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept into the sky, the barn was gone. It was a blackened, skeletal ruin, smoke still rising from the smoldering ashes in a mournful prayer. I sat on the frozen steps of the porch, Tommy wrapped in a blanket in my lap, his small body trembling. I stared at the ruin, a hollow, empty feeling in the pit of my stomach. Everything was gone. The hay, the tools, the tack, the very symbol of our livelihood. "It was set," Silas said, his voice quiet and lethal. He held up a charred piece of a kerosene can he had found in the snow near the back wall. "This was Stone's work, on Thorn's orders. I'd bet my life on it." "It doesn't matter who did it," I said, my voice a dull, lifeless monotone. "It's done. We're done." Silas knelt in the snow beside me, his face streaked with soot, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. "Don't you say that. Don't you dare even think it." "What else is there to think?" I asked, looking at him, my own eyes empty of everything but despair. "He's won, Silas. Thorn has won. We have nothing left. We have this house," he said, gesturing with his head. "We have the horses. We have each other. We have a mortgage payment due in 2 weeks and not a dollar to our name." The words were a raw, ragged cry. "I am tired of fighting, Silas. I am so tired." He reached out his hand, coming up to cup my face, his thumb gently brushing away a tear that had cut a clean path through the soot on my cheek. "That woman," he said, his voice low and firm, "the one who threw herself at a wolf to save her horse, the one who pulled 3 animals from a burning barn. That woman is not beaten." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against mine. "She is the strongest person I have ever known, and she is not alone." He stood then, pulling me to my feet. He looked from the smoldering ruin of the barn to the untouched cabin, then back to me, a new hard determination in his eyes. "He made a mistake, Eleanor," he said. "What are you talking about, Thorn? He should have burned the house." His gaze was chilling. "He left the one thing that matters. He left you. As long as you're standing, this fight isn't over." He looked at Tommy, still huddled in my arms. "And I'll be damned if I let that man take this home away from your son." In the days that followed the fire, a new grim reality set in. The destruction of the barn was more than a financial blow. It was a psychological one. It was a constant smoldering reminder of our vulnerability, of the ruthless forces aligned against us. The blackened timbers stood like a monument to Marcus Thorne's malice. We built a makeshift 3-sided shelter for the horses against the cabin's east wall, using salvaged half-burnt timbers and old blankets. It was a pathetic structure, offering little protection against the biting wind, but it was all we could manage. The cold was relentless. Food became a critical daily concern. We were down to flour, a little salt pork, and the last of the potatoes. I made thin stews and thinner soups, stretching every meager resource. The hunger was a constant dull ache in my belly, but seeing the gauntness in Tommy's face was a sharper pain than any I had ever known. One morning, Silas took his rifle and headed into the hills. He returned late that night, empty-handed, his face etched with a frustration he couldn't hide. "Nothing," he said, sinking wearily into a chair by the fire. "The game has been driven to lower elevations by the deep snow. There's nothing moving up there." The unspoken words hung in the air between us. We were running out of time. The next morning brought a surprise. A sleigh appeared on the horizon, and my first instinct was to reach for the rifle. But as it drew closer, I recognized the stoic, familiar figure of Lars Olsen. He pulled up to the cabin, and his wife Helga climbed down, carrying a large cloth-covered basket. Lars, a man of few words, simply nodded at me, his eyes taking in the ruined barn. "A bad business," he grunted. Helga pressed the basket into my hands. "We do not have much," she said, her accent thick. "But no one should starve." I lifted the cloth. Inside was a fresh-baked loaf of dark rye bread, a crock of butter, a jar of pickled beets, and wrapped in wax paper a generous chunk of salt-cured venison. My eyes filled with tears. I can't pay you for this, Helga," I whispered. "This is not for pay," she said, her weathered face softening. "This is for neighbors. You sat with our Anna for 3 nights when she had the fever last year. We do not forget." She looked past me at Silas, who stood quietly in the doorway. Her gaze was direct and appraising. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A good man is a strong roof in a storm. Before I could respond, another sleigh appeared. It was Mary Patterson from the ranch to the south, a woman I barely knew. She brought a sack of potatoes and a small bag of coffee. "Heard you had some trouble," she said, avoiding my eyes, as if embarrassed by her own kindness. "This isn't charity. It's for the time Arthur helped my husband pull his bull out of the mud. A debt paid. Throughout the day they came. Not a flood, but a slow, steady trickle. People who had kept their distance, swayed by the town's gossip, now came forward. They were the small ranchers, the homesteaders, people who understood the struggle, who knew what it was to be at the mercy of the winter and the wealthy. They brought what little they could spare, a few eggs, a jar of preserves, some feed for the horses, even a handful of rifle cartridges. Each small offering was a defiant act against Marcus Thorne, a quiet declaration of allegiance. By evening, our larder was no longer bare, and my heart, which I had thought frozen solid with despair, began to ache with a profound, overwhelming gratitude. They had not saved us, not entirely, but they had given us something just as valuable, the will to keep fighting. That night after Tommy was asleep, Silas and I sat by the fire, the cabin filled with the unfamiliar, wonderful smell of baking bread. We had counted the money Silas had and the few dollars our neighbors had pressed into my hand. It was not enough. Not even close. We were still more than a week from the 1st of March, and $100 short of the mortgage payment. It's not enough, I said. The words a stark reality in the warm room. We'll find a way, Silas said, but for the first time I heard a note of doubt in his voice. He looked at me then, his face serious in the firelight. He reached across the table and took my hands in his. Eleanor, he began, his voice low and intense. I have nothing to offer you. Not a home, not a name that isn't tarnished by my past. I am a drifter with nothing but the clothes on my back and a story full of ghosts. Silas, what are you saying? I am saying that I love you. He said the words simple, direct, and utterly devastating in their sincerity. I think I started loving you the moment I saw you standing on that porch, rifle in hand, ready to take on the world alone. I am saying that I want to stand beside you in this fight and in all the fights to come. I want to be a father to your son. I want to be your husband. He dropped to one knee on the rough-hewn floor of my cabin, his large calloused hands still holding mine. Tommy's whittled bird sat on the mantelpiece behind him. I know this is no proper proposal, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I have no ring to offer you, no fancy words. But I can offer you my whole heart. I can offer you my strength to work alongside you and my gun to defend you. I can offer you my life, Eleanor, whatever is left of it. Will you marry me? Will you let me build a life here with you? And the boy, tears streamed down my face. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so profound, so unexpected it felt like a miracle. Say yes, Mama, a small voice piped up from the doorway. Tommy stood there, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, a small, hopeful smile on his face. Say yes so Silas can be my papa for real. I dropped to my knees too, so we were all on the same level, a small, battered circle of hope in the vast, cold wilderness. I framed Silas's face with my hands, my thumbs tracing the weary lines around his eyes. Yes, I whispered the word. A release, a promise, a beginning. Yes to all of it. He kissed me then, a kiss that sealed the vow, with Tommy cheering and wrapping his arms around us both. In that moment, the cold, the hunger, and the fear receded. We had no money, no barn, and a powerful enemy who wanted us destroyed. But we had love. We had each other. And we had the defiant, stubborn hope of our neighbors. We had just enough to keep the wolves at bay. The next morning, we woke to find fresh hoofprints in the snow circling the cabin, a silent, menacing reminder that our enemies were still watching. But the fear was different now. It was no longer the paralyzing fear of a lone woman. It was the galvanizing anger of a family under threat. Thorne's men, Silas set his jaw tight as he examined the tracks. They're testing our defenses, trying to spook us. Let them test, I said, my voice hard. We're not running. But that night the wolves came. Not the two-legged kind, but a pack of the real thing, driven down from the high country by starvation. Their howls echoed through the valley, a chilling primordial sound that raised the hair on my arms. They circled the makeshift pen where the horses huddled, their lean shapes dark shadows against the moonlit snow. Silas and I stood watch together, our rifles ready. When the pack finally attacked, a blur of gray fur and flashing teeth, the fight was a terrifying, chaotic explosion of sound and motion. Silas's aim was unnervingly true. He dropped two of the beasts before they even reached the pen. I fired, wounding another, and sending it yelping back into the darkness. But the pack leader, a massive, cunning wolf, broke through. It didn't go for the horses. It came for me. It launched itself at me, its weight knocking me off my feet, and into the snow, its breath, a hot, foul stench on my face. Its teeth snapped inches from my throat. I swung the butt of the rifle, connecting with its head with a sickening thud. It staggered back, and in that split second, Silas's shot rang out. The wolf collapsed in a heap not 5 feet from where I lay. Silas hauled me to my feet, his face a pale mask of terror in the moonlight, his hands frantically checking me for bites. I'm fine, I gasped, my body trembling with adrenaline. I'm fine. You are insane, he said, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. He pulled me into a crushing embrace. Throwing yourself at a wolf. It was coming for you, I said, simply burying my face in his chest. I couldn't let it. We stood there in the snow, surrounded by the bodies of the wolves, the frightened horses stamping nearby, holding on to each other, as if we were the only two people left in the world. And I knew then that we had already won the most important battle. We had chosen to stand and fight for our land, for our son, and for each other, no matter what came next. 5 days, I whispered against his chest. 5 days until the mortgage is due. 5 days, he agreed, his voice a low rumble. We can make it 5 more days. But as we dragged the wolf carcasses away from the pen, we both saw the fresh hoof prints in the snow not far from where the attack had happened. And we both saw the glint of light from the ridge above a fleeting sparkle that might have been the moon on ice, or might have been the reflection from a spyglass. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge was a stark, imposing block of red brick against the winter sky, a monument to a law I was no longer sure I believed in. I climbed the frozen wooden steps, my hand tucked into the crook of Silas's arm. He wore a clean shirt and his least worn coat, but the Colt revolver on his hip was a stark reminder that this was more than a legal proceeding. It was a battle in a war. Tommy walked between us, his small hand holding tightly to mine. Inside, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. It seemed the entire county had turned out for the spectacle of the widow Vance's final stand. I saw the faces of the neighbors who had helped us, their expressions grim and supportive. I also saw the smug, expectant faces of Marcus Thorne's allies. Thorne himself sat in the front row, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive city suits, looking for all the world like a king holding court. Elijah Abernathy approached us, a sheaf of papers in his hand, his smile as thin and cold as winter ice. Right on time, Mrs. Vance. I trust you have the payment. Every penny, I said, my hand instinctively going to the pouch of coins and bills tucked inside my coat. It was a motley collection, the physical embodiment of our neighbor's faith. Ah, but there is another matter to be addressed first, Abernathy said, gesturing toward the judge's bench. Judge Carlton, a heavy man whose face seemed to be melting into his collar, was taking his seat. Mr. Marcus Thorne has filed a legal injunction, Abernathy announced, his voice ringing with triumph, questioning your very right to this property. The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold and dizzy. What Thorne rose, his movements theatrical. It is quite simple, Your Honor. My legal counsel has discovered significant irregularities in the original land deed filed by the late Mr. Arthur Vance. The property boundaries as he filed them do not in fact match the official federal survey of this county. That is a lie, I said, my voice coming out as a choked whisper. I started forward, but Silas's hand on my arm stopped me. His grip was a firm, steady anchor. Let me, he murmured, then addressed the judge, his voice clear and strong. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a last-ditch effort by a wealthy man to steal land from a widow he has already tried to burn out and starve out. A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Carlton peered over his spectacles, his expression sour. And you are, I am, Silas Cole, Mrs. Vance's intended husband, Silas, said the words, a proud declaration that sent another ripple through the courtroom. I see, the judge said, his tone making it clear he did not approve. Well, Mr. Cole, Mr. Thorne has presented documentation. Unless Mrs. Vance can provide proof of her claim, I have the original deed, I said, my hands shaking as I pulled the worn papers from my coat. Signed and witnessed. One of Thorne's lawyers, a sharp-faced man named Crawford, stood. Your Honor, we do not dispute the existence of the deed. We dispute its accuracy. Our surveyor has found that the Vance property as deeded encroaches on Mr. Thorne's land by nearly 40 acres, and those 40 acres conveniently include the sole water rights to Willow Creek. The creek has always been our boundary, I protested, my voice trembling with outrage. According to your husband's filing, yes, Crawford said smoothly. He produced a large official-looking map with elaborate seals, but according to the federal survey of 1,876, the true boundary runs a quarter-mile east of the creek, placing the water squarely on Mr. Thorne's property. I stared at the map, my mind reeling. It was a brilliant evil trap. Even if I paid the mortgage without access to water, the land was worthless. I would be forced to sell to him for pennies. This is fraud, Silas, said, his voice flat and dangerous. That map has been doctored. Crawford's expression hardened. That is a serious, unsubstantiated accusation, Mr. Cole. Can you prove it? Can you prove it isn't? Silas countered. Judge Carlton slammed his gavel. Order, Mr. Crawford. What evidence do you have beyond this map? The sworn testimony of our surveyor, Mr. Bernard Hicks, Your Honor, Crawford replied. I watched as Hicks took the stand. He was a thin, nervous man who couldn't seem to stop glancing at Marcus Thorne. His testimony was a damning litany of angles, measurements, and legal jargon, all of it pointing to one conclusion: my husband had either been a fool or a thief. When he finished, the judge turned to me. Mrs. Vance, do you have any evidence or witnesses to refute this testimony? My mind raced a frantic search for a lifeline. Who could argue with the surveyor's map? Then a memory surfaced. Arthur talking with our neighbor. Lars Olsen, I said, my voice finding a new strength. He homesteaded his property years before my husband arrived. He knows the true boundaries. There was a stir as Lars made his way to the front. His weathered face set in grim, determined lines. He took the oath with a solemn dignity. Mr. Olsen, I began acting as my own counsel out of pure necessity. How long have you lived on your property? 23 years this spring. Lars answered, his voice a slow, deep rumble. I was here before there was a town. Before Mr. Thorne built his big house. And the boundary between your land and mine, Willow Creek, he said without hesitation. Always has been. I helped Arthur Vance survey it myself when he bought the land. We used the federal markers. Stone cairns the army surveyors put in. Crawford leaped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, hearsay. Where are these supposed markers now? Lars's face darkened. That is a funny thing. I went to check them last month after Mr. Thorne's men started sniffing around. They were gone. Dug right out of the ground. Looked to be recent work, too. The courtroom erupted in whispers. I saw Thorne exchange a dark, fleeting glance with Jed Stone, who stood impassively at the back of the room. Without the markers, it is merely your word against a certified survey, Crawford said dismissively. Not just my word, Lars said calmly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger. I keep records. Of everything. Weather, planting, calving boundaries. He opened it to a page covered in neat, deliberate script. The 15th of August, 1876. Helped Army surveyors place boundary markers. Stone cairns 3 feet high at quarter-mile intervals along the west bank of Willow Creek. I even wrote down their names, a Lieutenant Morrison and a lead surveyor named McBain. Crawford's smug expression faltered. Those men could be dead, or transferred to the other side of the country. McBain is not dead, a voice called from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. It was Doc Miller, the town's physician. He stood, his face grim. He is my wife's brother. He lives in Denver. I can have a telegram sent to him for confirmation of his original survey. Judge Carlton was beginning to look deeply uncomfortable. This is becoming highly irregular. Perhaps a postponement is in order. Your Honor, Thorne stood, his voice booming with indignation. This is a farce. We are taking the word of an old immigrant farmer and a woman of questionable morals against an official certified document. Questionable morals. My temper, held in check for so long, finally snapped. How dare you? You have been cohabitating with a man who is not your husband. Thorne said, his voice dripping with venom. Everyone in this county knows it. Is this the sort of person we want holding property in our community? A woman who flaunts propriety, who consorts with a known gunman. That is enough. Silas said, his voice deadly quiet. But Thorne was relentless. Your Honor, even if the boundaries were in dispute, Mrs. Vance has proven herself incapable of managing the property. Her barn burned to the ground. She has lost most of her cattle. She is behind on her accounts all over town. And now she is taken up with a drifter with blood on his hands. For the good of the community, you must rule in my favor. For the good of your bank account, you mean? I shot back, my voice ringing through the silent courtroom. You want my water rights because your own cattle have overgrazed your land into a desert. You have tried to buy me out, threaten me out, and burn me out. And now you are trying to lie me out of my home. Can you prove any of these wild accusations? Crawford demanded. Can you prove Mr. Hicks actually surveyed that land? Silas countered, stepping forward. Or did he just draw the lines on the map where Mr. Thorne told him to? Hicks, the surveyor, went pale. I stand by my survey. Do you? Silas asked, his voice soft but carrying an immense weight. He walked toward the witness stand, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room. Would you swear on your mother's grave, Mr. Hicks, that you personally walked every foot of that boundary line, that you didn't just sit in a warm office and alter a copy of an old map for the money Mr. Thorne paid you? Hicks began to sweat. He glanced nervously at Thorne, who gave him a look of pure menace. There may have been some estimates made based on existing documentation. The courtroom exploded. Judge Carlton hammered his gavel, his face purple with rage. Order, order. When a semblance of quiet finally returned, the judge looked weary. It seems we have conflicting testimonies, missing evidence, and potential perjury. However, the burden of proof. Your Honor, A new voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned. It was Reverend Miller. He stood, his face pale, his hands trembling. My heart sank. Surely he would side with Thorne, the wealthiest and most powerful member of his congregation. "I have something I must say," the pastor continued, his voice shaking but determined. "My conscience will not allow me to remain silent. Last month I was visiting the saloon on a matter of pastoral care for Mr. Hutchkins, and I overheard Mr. Stone and another of Mr. Thorne's men. They were laughing about digging up some old rock piles out by Willow Creek. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now—" Jed Stone shot to his feet. "That's a damn lie, is it?" The Reverend pulled himself up straighter, a flicker of his forgotten moral courage returning. "I may not approve of Mrs. Vance's personal choices, Your Honor, but I approve far less of bearing false witness and stealing from a widow. What I heard was clear. They said Mr. Thorne would be pleased they were erasing the old lines so he could draw some new ones." The courtroom erupted into utter chaos. Thorne's face was a mask of fury. "This is a conspiracy. They are all lying." Judge Carlton's gavel cracked against the wood. "Mr. Thorne, control yourself, Mr. Stone. Do you deny these accusations?" Stone's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but he froze as Silas took a protective step in front of me. The two men locked eyes across the crowded room, a silent, deadly battle of wills. "I don't have to answer to some Bible-thumping hypocrite," Stone snarled. "No, Judge Carlton," said his voice ringing with newfound authority, "but you will answer to the law. Sheriff, I want Mr. Stone detained for questioning regarding the destruction of federal markers and conspiracy to commit fraud. And Mr. Hicks, I will be recommending a full investigation into your professional practices." He turned his stern gaze to me. "As for the matter at hand, Mrs. Vance, do you have your payment?" With hands that shook, I produced the pouch. "Every dollar, Your Honor." "Then the bank must accept it. The matter of the boundaries will require a full investigation, including a telegram to Surveyor McBain in Denver. But until such time as fraud can be definitively proven, the status quo stands. The Vance Ranch remains in the possession of Mrs. Vance." The gavel came down with a resounding final crack. Thorne stormed from the courtroom, his lawyers scurrying behind him like rats. Jed Stone had to be escorted out by the sheriff, but not before he shot Silas, a look of pure murderous hatred that promised revenge. As the courtroom emptied, people I didn't even know stopped to shake my hand or offer a word of support. The tide of public opinion so long against me had finally blessedly turned. Outside in the cold, bright sunshine, I sagged against Silas, the strength that had held me up for so long finally giving way. "We did it," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "We actually did it." "You did it, Eleanor," he corrected, his arm wrapping around me, holding me up. "You and a handful of good neighbors who wouldn't let a bully win." Tommy tugged on my coat. "Does this mean we get to keep our home, Mama?" "Yes, sweet boy," I said, scooping him into my arms and holding him tight. "We get to keep our home. And Silas gets to stay forever and be my papa," he persisted, his voice full of hope. Silas met my eyes over our son's head, his own gaze full of a love so profound it took my breath away. "If your mama will have me forever," he confirmed, and I didn't care who saw it when he kissed me right there on the courthouse steps. We had won the battle. But as we rode home through the crisp winter afternoon, I knew the war was not over. Men like Thorne did not surrender. And men like Jed Stone lived for revenge. But for the first time, I felt we had a real chance of winning. We had our land. We had each other. And we had proven that sometimes, even in the heart of a merciless winter, justice, like a stubborn seed, could find a way to break through the frozen ground. Spring arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a messy, violent thaw. The snow melted with a startling rapidity, turning the valley into a morass of mud and swelling Willow Creek into a raging, muddy torrent. The world seemed to be weeping away the bitterness of the long winter. With the thaw came a torrent of work, but it was work born of hope, not despair. With the help of Lars Olsen and other neighbors, we began to rebuild. A new, smaller barn rose from the ashes of the old, the scent of fresh-cut pine, a clean, promising smell that erased the memory of the fire. The community's support was a quiet but constant presence. Someone would leave a sack of seed on the porch, another would drop off a few laying hens to replace the ones we'd lost. These were not acts of charity, but of solidarity. In standing up to Marcus Thorne, we had become a symbol of defiance for every small rancher in the valley. The investigation into the boundary fraud proceeded slowly, but the telegram from Surveyor McBain in Denver confirmed Lars's account of the original markers. Thorne was mired in a legal battle that stripped him of his public standing, and his power began to wane. He remained a threat, a shadow on the horizon, but he was a diminished one. The real immediate threat was Jedediah Stone. He had been released from jail pending the investigation, a testament to Thorne's lingering influence. He was a snake coiled in the grass, and we never let our guard down. Silas was a constant watchful presence, his rifle or his pistol never far from his hand. In the midst of this fragile peace, we planned our wedding. It was to be a simple affair. Pastor Miller, his conscience apparently scoured clean by his courtroom testimony, had humbly offered to perform the ceremony. It would be my honor, he'd said, his gaze not quite meeting mine, to sanctify a union that has so clearly been forged by faith and perseverance. I had accepted not out of any great religious feeling, but because I wanted our union to be recognized to be solid and real in the eyes of the world. I wanted to be Mrs. Cole. The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the sky a brilliant washed-out blue. The air was soft, carrying the scent of damp earth and new leaves. Mary Patterson and Helga Olson helped me dress. They had taken my mother's wedding gown from its long storage, carefully mending the delicate lace and pressing the ivory silk. "You are a beautiful bride, Eleanor Mary," said, her eyes misty as she fastened the tiny pearl buttons down my back. "You look like a queen, Mama," Tommy said, his voice full of awe. He was dressed in a new suit of clothes, his auburn hair slicked down with water. When I walked out into the yard where our friends and neighbors had gathered, I saw Silas waiting for me under a bower of willow branches we had built. He turned, and the look on his face, a mixture of love, awe, and a fierce, wondering joy, was a more precious gift than any diamond. Lars Olson gave me away, his hand on my arm, a warm, paternal weight. Tommy stood beside Silas as his best man, his small face a mask of solemn importance. As Pastor Miller began to speak the familiar, time-honored words, I heard none of them. My entire world had narrowed to the man standing before me, to the promise in his pale blue eyes. "I, Silas Cole," he said, his voice low and steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he took mine. "Take you, Eleanor Vance, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold through winter's bite and spring's thaw, in hardship and in plenty. I promise to be a father to your son, a partner in your labors, and a guardian of your heart for all the days of my life." My own voice was strong and clear when I repeated my vows, my heart so full it felt as if it might burst. "And I promise to stand beside you, to build with you a life worthy of the fight it took to win it, and to love you with all that I am forever. By the power vested in me," the pastor declared, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Silas's kiss was tender, a gentle sealing of the fierce vows we had made, and the small gathering erupted in cheers. Tommy immediately launched himself at us, wrapping his arms around both our legs, and Silas scooped him up, holding him between us, as we stood together, a family at last forged in the crucible of a Wyoming winter. The celebration was simple and joyous. Fiddle music filled the air as we ate, and laughed, the hardships of the past months momentarily forgotten. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in glorious shades of orange and rose, I saw Silas stiffen. His gaze was fixed on the ridge overlooking our property. I followed his eyes and saw a lone figure on horseback silhouetted against the setting sun, Jedediah Stone. A collective gasp went through the party. The music faltered and died. The laughter ceased. Our neighbors began to gather their children, their faces pale with fear. "Get everyone inside the house," Eleanor, Silas said, his voice deadly calm. He pushed me gently toward the cabin. "Take Tommy and get inside." "No," I said, my hand closing over his arm. "Not this time. We face this together." He looked at me, a flicker of protest in his eyes, but then he saw the unyielding resolve in my face and simply nodded. Stone began to ride down from the ridge, not fast, but with a slow, deliberate menace. He was alone. "This is between me and him," Silas said. "Stay back." He walked out to meet Stone in the open space between the new barn and the house, his body, a stark, lonely figure in the fading light. He didn't draw his gun, but stood with his hands loose at his sides. Stone reined in his horse about 30 yards away. "Cole," he snarled, his face a twisted mask of hatred. "You cost me everything. Thorne cut me loose. The law is looking for me. I've got nothing left to lose." "This is your own doing, Jed," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Ride away now and live what life you have left. The only way I'm leaving this valley is after I've watched you die, Stone spat. His hand dropped to his gun. It was over in a heartbeat. It was a blur of motion so fast my mind could barely register it. Stone's gun cleared his holster, but Silas's was already there. A single shot cracked through the evening air. Stone's body jerked in the saddle, a look of profound surprise on his face. He stared at Silas for a long moment, then slowly, gracefully, he tumbled to the ground. Silence. A profound, ringing silence. Then Tommy broke from my side, running toward Silas, and the spell was broken. I ran after him, my heart hammering. Silas holstered his pistol and knelt, catching our son in his arms, burying his face in the boy's hair. When I reached them, he looked up at me, his face pale, the ghosts of 100 battles in his eyes. "It's over, Eleanor," he whispered. "It's finally over." And it was. The war was over. We buried Jedediah Stone in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property. The sheriff came and asked his questions and left, closing the book on the matter. Marcus Thorne, his last weapon gone, sold his vast holdings a month later and moved back east, a defeated man. The valley could breathe again. The ranch prospered under our combined care. The cattle grew fat and healthy on the lush spring grass. The horses multiplied, and we rebuilt the chicken coop bigger and better than before. Our lives, once a desperate scramble for survival, settled into a peaceful, hard-working rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the land. A year after our wedding, I gave birth to a daughter, Sarah, a beautiful, bright-eyed girl with her father's pale blue eyes and my stubborn chin. Our family was complete. Our home, once a place of sorrow, was now filled with the sounds of laughter and life. We had started with nothing but loss and loneliness. We had faced down the winter, both the one in the world and the one in our hearts. But in the end, love had won. Not the easy, gentle love of stories, but a hard-won love forged in fire and ice, tempered by trust and sacrifice. The widow and the drifter had found in each other what neither had dared hope for: a second chance at happiness, a family rebuilt from ashes, and a future bright with promise under the endless western sky. Sometimes on a cool summer evening, as we sit on the porch watching Tommy, now a tall, capable boy, teach his little sister how to skip stones on the now gentle creek, Silas will take my hand. His hands are still calloused, but they are the hands that rebuilt my life, the hands that hold my heart. "No regrets?" he'll ask softly, his eyes searching mine, the same pale, piercing blue that had captivated me from the very first. "None," I always answer, my heart full. "Not a single one." And if the good people of Cedar Ridge sometimes still whispered about the scandal of how it all began, well, we were too busy living to care. We had each other. We had our children, enjoying these epic Wild West stories. Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.